Why I didn't pay my taxi fare. This story goes back around 50 years ago. A young teenager was studying at a yeshiva, which is a study school where you study Judaism for young students in Jerusalem in Israel. Now in Israel, those days was very common how people would hitchhike. It was very common. You would stand at the corner and you would wave your hand and you would just go into a stranger's car and they will give you a lift to where you want to go. In Hebrew, it's called a tramp. That's what the word is for hitchhiking. And it is very, very common. Although nowadays one needs to be a little more careful as the world has changed since then. But then it was very common that students specifically would get from neighborhood to neighborhood by hitchhiking. So this individual student who was studying in a yeshiva, and he was studying Talmud, which is the commentary to the Torah. And in these study halls, students generally study in pairs. And if you ever had a chance to peek into a study hall or one of these yeshivot, you would be amazed to hear the sound of Torah, the sound of Judaism in the most incredible way. As a matter of fact, going back to the Holocaust days, one of the most notorious individuals was Eichmann. Eichmann, may his name be blotted from history, was the architect of Hitler's death machine that eventually killed 6 million Jews. Miraculously, the Israeli Secret Service was able to capture him and bring him back to Israel to be on trial. In 1961, he was tried in front of the whole country and found guilty, of course, for his terrible crimes. And eventually he was executed. Very recently, a gentleman came forward for an interview. His job was to protect Eichmann. That as long as he was incarcerated in the maximum security, his job was to make sure that no one took revenge on him and no one was trying to silence him. He recently gave an interview and he shared with the interview about his experience. And very interestingly, he was the one who was responsible that anytime they brought food to Eichmann, that he had to taste it first. And if he didn't die in 3 minutes, then he knew the food wasn't poisoned. That's how responsible he was. What makes this story special was that when they asked him for the interview, I think it was BBC who found his name and asked him for the interview. He said he would agree to give the interview under one condition, that the interview takes place in the study hall, in the yeshiva, where the students study. And they said, it's going to be very complicated. We usually do these interviews in our studio where there are lights and sound checks, and there's going to be too many distractions. He said, if you want me to give you the interview, it's going to have to be in a yeshiva hall, in a study hall where there are hundreds of students studying the Talmud. They had no choice but to give in, and he spoke to the head of the yeshiva and they agreed to it. He sat at one of the desks And here in the background, you're hearing hundreds of students studying. And he gave his interview. And they kept on asking him the various questions about his relationship with Eichmann and what his responsibilities. So he went through everything. The final question they asked him, why did you insist in having the interview in the study hall? And he answered, says, I know that this interview is going to be most valuable. It's one of a kind. And I know all Germany will be watching this. I want them to see that what Hitler tried to do to extinguish the Jewish spirit, he failed. How do you see that he failed? Look at these hundreds of students who are studying the same Torah from 3,300 years ago. Not just studying it, but studying it with joy, with fervor, with spirit, with excitement, exuberance. That's the sound that I want every single German to see how Hitler failed. Now, this is a side note to the story that I'm sharing with you. So this yeshiva student needed to get a hitch from one neighborhood to the next neighborhood. He waved down a taxi. He got into the taxi and he told him where he wants to go. And the taxi began the meter. And this young student took out his book and continued studying. He got so involved in his studying that he totally forgot that he was sitting in the back seat of the taxi. As soon as the taxi came to a stop, it says, student, here I am, here you are. The student gets out, says thank you, and leaves, closes the door, and takes off without paying the taxi fare. Now this is a student who's studying the Torah. He's God-fearing, he's observant. About a block away, he says to himself, oh my God, was that a hitchhike or was that a taxi? Oh my God, I made a mistake. I thought I was hitchhiking, but he was a taxi and I left without paying him. How can I dare do that? He turned around and he saw the taxi leaving. The taxi driver was very disappointed. He says, how can the yeshiva student who's sitting and studying the Torah, in the Ten Commandments it says thou shalt not steal, how can this yeshiva student commit this type of a sin so blatantly? I don't get it. But he figures, what am I going to do? He turns the car around. In the meantime, the yeshiva student began running when he realized what he did. And he began shouting, hey, hey, taxi, wait, wait, wait. The taxi kept on going. This yeshiva student kept on running after the taxi. 5, 6, 7 blocks until finally there's a red light. And the yeshiva student caught up to the taxi. He pounded on the window. And the taxi driver got scared. What's going on? Says, oh, please, I am so sorry. I didn't realize that I left your car without paying you. I mixed you up with a hitchhike, but I didn't realize that I committed to pay you for the trip. I'm so sorry. Please let me pay you. And the taxi driver couldn't believe it. He sees he's so out of breath. He broke into a great sweat. He obviously has been running for 8 blocks. He just couldn't believe his eyes. He says, this is incredible. And the yeshiva student paid him the fare, and they both parted ways. The yeshiva student walked slowly back home, and he thought to himself, how fortunate I was to be able to set the wrong right. How could have I lived with myself by letting this taxi driver leave without me paying the fare? Fast forward 50 years, 5 decades later, 50 years later. This grown man, father of a beautiful family, lives in the neighborhood, and he goes to pray at a certain synagogue. And next to the synagogue, there's a yeshiva. one that he used to go to as a teenager. And the rabbi there gives lectures once a week. And he enjoys the lecture. So he went to one of the lectures. And in the lecture, the rabbi is talking about that whenever a person does an extraordinary act, they will always see the fruits of their labor in a revealed way. It says anyone who does something extraordinary, anyone who sanctifies God's name, which means does something extraordinary just because it's the right thing to do, and you go out of your way to sanctify God's name in a public way or in a great way, you are guaranteed to see the fruits of your labor. And that was the crux of the class. The whole theme of the lecture was encouraging people to do the extraordinary. And they should not underestimate its impact. How doing the extraordinary will eventually bear its fruit in a revealed way. You know, we have done things in life, we have done heroic things, but we never get to see the outcome. The lecturer here was guaranteeing that you will see the outcome. It's inevitable. You're not going to live out the rest of your life unless you see direct results of your extraordinary heroic act. And the rabbi went on quoting various sages, various books, various scriptures supporting his concept. After the lecture was over, this gentleman goes over to the rabbi and says, "Rabbi, I listened to your lecture, and you seem to be so certain that any time you do an extraordinary act to sanctify God's name, that you'll be revealed of its results." He says, let me share with you a story. I was 15 years old. I did something extraordinary wrong. I took a taxi and I left without paying a fare. When I realized how wrong that was, it was totally unintentionally. I did something extraordinary. I turned around, I ran 8 to 10 blocks until I was able to chase down that taxi driver. And I was able to find him at a red light. I was sweating, I was out of breath, and he rolled down the window and I paid him the fare. And, I thought to myself, that was an extraordinary act. I didn't have to do that. He would have forgiven me. I would have gone on with my life. But I remember when I did that extraordinary act, because it was a hard 8-block run in the heat of the Israeli summer, but I knew I had to do it, and I never wondered what was the impression that I left on the taxi driver. Did it ever mean anything to him? Was it extraordinary? Was I sanctifying God's name in a heroic, extraordinary? For me, as a 15-year-old, I thought it was heroic. I thought that me running 8 to 10 blocks after a taxi just to pay the fare, it's got to be rated somewhere up there in the heresy guidelines. It was heroic. And it was extraordinary, and the taxi driver wasn't a religious Jew. I must have impressed upon him. I thought, I don't know, but it's been 50 years. And I don't know what to make of it. You said in your lecture that you guaranteed that any time you sanctify God's name in public, you will see the results in it in your lifetime. Well, I haven't seen the results of it. The rabbi is giving the lecture, looks at him and says, "The results of your act 50 years ago is standing right in front of your eyes." He says, "What?" He says, "I was that young taxi driver. When you ran those 8 blocks and pounded on my window, and you paid me the money that you owed me that you mistakenly did not, You left such an impression on me. I was at the time not religious at all. I was very foreign to traditional Judaism and its observances. But after your heroic act, when I saw you shedding those sweat, your whole body was trembling, you were out of breath, just to make a wrong right, I said to myself, this is the religion that I need to learn more about. This is the religion that I need to connect with. This is a religion that has meaning, has purpose, and is effective. It was because of your act that day that I began studying, and I enrolled in a yeshiva, and I learned Judaism, and I excelled very well in my studies. And I am a lecturer, Rabbi now, all because of your heroic act. Yes, it's been 50 years, but you're standing right in front of the results. You can only imagine what kind of reunion that was. You can only imagine what it was like, both for the student and the taxi driver, to have been reunited yet once again, and under these amazing circumstances. When I heard this story, I heard this from Rabbi Stuhlberger. It really resonated. I look back on my life, the last 40 years that I have worked as a senior rabbi, the founder and the one who established our synagogue, Chabad Poway. And I think of the blood, sweat, and tears that my wife and I invested in this community. At times you wonder, do we get to see the results of our hard work? Sometimes we have, sometimes we are still waiting. But after hearing this story, we are reassured to know that no good deed goes unanswered and unrewarded, just like in this story. And I share this with you so you too should never underestimate the extraordinary that you do, the extraordinary opportunities that comes your way. Do not underestimate its ripple effect. You may not see it right away. It may take 50 years, but just like in this story, you will see it. God bless you. God loves you. May God bless our brothers and sisters in Israel and bring home all the hostage safety.